Hello, and welcome back to the Queen City Guitar Shop. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about installing frets into a guitar fretboard. On the face of it, it's a pretty simple procedure, but like many simple procedures, if you ignore the details, it can go south pretty quick, and it can be really frustrating when the frets go wrong in a guitar. Often, the fret ends will be loose, things like that. They're not very even. It can be really frustrating when that happens because the frets have such a huge impact on the playability of the guitar. If you have frets that are bouncing up and down, it's basically impossible to get a really good setup on it. And the best time to address issues with fretting is when you're putting the frets in the guitar. And believe it or not, we're also going to talk a little bit about the wonders of hide glue, at least as it relates to my fretting process. So if you're like me and you like hide glue, it might be interesting for that. But yeah, before we get into actually putting the frets in the guitars, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fret wire itself, and a little bit about the prep we need to do to the fretboard before we actually install the frets. So if we look at modern fret wire, I'll note that I'm using like nickel silver wire. There's a variety of materials people make fret wire out of. Stainless is probably the most notable. It's gaining in popularity. And if you use stainless, it is going to require more expensive tooling because it's harder than the nickel silver, and it'll damage tools intended for nickel silver wire. But I think the nickel silver is plenty hard, and that's what I use. And all the modern fret wire is going to be pretty similar in anatomy, and it's going to be sort of mushroom shaped if we look at it from the side. The stock is what's called the tang. It's this strip of metal that's actually going to go into our fret slot. On the tang is going to be a series of sort of triangular barbs, sort of like arrowheads. When you push it in, they're sort of shaped like this. So they go into the slot, and then they help to keep it from coming back out. And so the tang and the barbs together are going to help to create a mechanical fit into the fret itself, into the fret slot itself, and keep the fret from coming up. The fret barbs also help to chip out the fretboard when somebody refrets it in the future, but it's a trade-off, good and bad. That's what we're going to be focusing on most today. And then on top of the fret, the mushroom cap portion in this profile is going to be the crown, and the crown is going to have an effect more for playing the guitar, the feel of playing it, how tall, how wide it is. They come in a variety of sizes. The tang comes in different sizes as well, and it's important to keep in mind all of the sizes for your guitar so you have fret wire that you're happy with. But like I said, today we're mostly concerned with the tang because it has the most to do with actually installing the frets into the fret slots. So it's important to note that your tang needs to be compatible with the slots you cut, which means it needs to be compatible with the saw you're using to cut the fret slots. If the fret slots are too wide, then if they're wider than the barbs themselves, the fret's just going to come in and out. It's not going to hold in at all. And if they're a little bit wider than the tang, as it gets wider, it's going to lose holding power. And that's no good, because we want that mechanical fit into the fret slot itself. Conversely, if it gets smaller than the tang itself, that can initially help to hold it in. If it gets too small, it's of course going to be hard to hammer it in. But then there's another point where it's smaller than the tang itself, and you get a back bow from the frets installed. Essentially, like, it needs to spread each slot to fit the tang inside, and so the fretboard is going to kind of curve back. People will use that on guitars without truss rods. If you want to counteract the relief the strings are going to pull in, if the feeling is that the strings are going to pull in too much, or maybe you're refretting a guitar and the strings are pulling too much relief in, you can slightly oversize the frets, create a back bow, and counteract that. But if you're doing it on a brand new guitar, it takes a little finessing to know how much pressure, how much compression to put in the frets themselves, and how much is going to be too much. It definitely is warranting caution and a fair amount of experience at what it's going to do and what the finished product is going to be, because if you put too much back bow in, you're either going to be taking a bunch out of the frets to make it level again, or you're going to be refretting the guitar, which is probably the more likely thing. So yeah, this isn't particularly focused on slotting today. The slotting of the fretboard happens long before this process, but it is worth noting that your fret saw and the slots on here and the frets themselves need to be compatible to get a satisfying install of the frets and what you're going to be happy with. So the other thing to think about, probably the predominant thing to think about before we actually install the frets, is going to be to make sure that the surface of the fretboard and everything we want to do with the wood on the surface of the fretboard pretty much is dealt with and we're happy with, because once we put the frets in, we're not going to be able to adjust anything for like the playability of those frets. We could scallop the fingerboard out in between the frets, but we can't actually touch the wood that the frets are sitting on. And so any changes we make that are going to have something to do with the playability of the guitar as it relates to the surface of the frets and the string path, it's going to have to be taken out of the frets themselves. So it's always better to make sure that you're happy with the fretboard and that it's ready to be fretted before installing the actual frets. I've done the radius on this, and I've installed my fret markers on the fretboard and leveled them down. And so the next step is going to be to flatten the fretboard. Excuse me. To flatten the fretboard. I use air quotes because it's kind of a misnomer to say flatten the fretboard. Obviously, on a steel string like this, I've got a radius, and so at no point is it going to be flat. Really, like really flat. And you could say it's going to be flat in the string pads, and that's kind of true, but it's not necessarily true or necessarily a thing to actually aim for it to be dead flat in the string pads. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If we were dealing with, say we have, this is a cantilever neck, the guitar that I'm building, so it's going to differ a little bit, but we're going to focus on a traditional guitar with a glue down extension, which is probably what most people are building. It's, you know, every guitar I've built so far before this one has been that. So if we're dealing with that, and I make this completely flat in the string path, then a couple things are going to happen. One is that I've got a dual action truss rod in this neck and in all the necks that I build, and so I'm going to get a lot of adjustability, you know, forward of the heel, but I'm not going to get any adjustability beyond the neck joint. There's a truss rod in there. There's no way that I can adjust that. And so if you think about, you know, you want relief in the neck, you want that parabola that's going to match the string as it vibrates, and it's going to allow you to get the strings low and also not have the string buzzing on frets. So the strings are going to pull a nice relief, and the truss rod is there to compensate in any way that it needs to, up to, you know, where the heel gets really thick just before the join. So that's fine. But then with no relief here, and if I've got this totally flat, then what's going to end up happening is that as far as the strings are concerned, you know, 14 is going to be higher than 13, 15 is going to be higher than 14, 16 is going to be higher than 15, 17 is going to be higher than 16, and that's the exact opposite of what I want. If you want to visualize this a little better, I think it's helpful to make a drawing, like a scale, one-to-one scale drawing of the fingerboard, all the way back to the bridge and the saddle, and then the string paths to the saddle. And imagine if it was flat, and imagine it if it has, you know, that nice relief curve in it. The relief curve is going to allow the strings to move up and down without interfering with the frets below them. And you have to, when you're talking about the height of the frets, like this might be totally flat, but since we have to consider the relation between the strings and the relation of this plane as it moves towards the bridge, if this is totally flat, then what's actually happening is it's too tall as we move down. So I want, with a good relief, what I want is ideally, for 13 to be slightly higher in relation to the strings than 14, and 14 is slightly higher than 15, and 15 is slightly higher than 16, and so forth. And of course, it's very small changes down here. The relief is going to be, it's going to be most pronounced up towards the nut, and it's going to get less and less as we come down here. But it still needs to fall away a little bit to get that relief, and there's no way to mechanically put it in with the strings or with the truss rod on an acoustic guitar, such as this, and such as 99.9% of people are building. It's just not going to happen. If your geometry is like great, and if the design is really good, ordinarily you can just take it out of the frets to get the relief right, but then you're just unnecessarily lowering those frets. And the other issue that is going to arise on a traditional glue down extension guitar is that as soon as you put string tension on it, it is going to start the slow process of folding up on itself, the process that's eventually going to lead it to need a neck reset. And there's nothing you can do about that. But as soon as you string it up, it's going to cause what I've often referred to as like the ski jump, which is going to be at the joint of the guitar, of the neck to the body. It's going to kind of hop up, and that's because essentially the neck is folding from that point, and so these go from being like flat to being sort of like this, and that creates a problem that it's slowly getting worse, and it can be difficult to predict. If you've built the same guitar several times, you can get an idea for what that's going to do. But it can be difficult to exactly predict what it's going to do when you first string it up. And that can cause problems, especially if you're trying to get a really tight setup when you first do the guitar. Again, you can work that out through the frets, but you're just dropping the frets down. You're taking life away from the frets by lowering the crown to compensate for that. At the same time, I don't want to take too much off. Overcompensate, and then this drastically drops off, and suddenly you get above the neck joint, and your action goes crazy. People don't, constantly play above the neck joint on acoustic guitars, but it's not uncommon, and it's already difficult because the body's in the way. But then if the action is going to suddenly start increasing a huge amount, it's going to get much more difficult to get a good sound and to feel good playing in that range. So you don't want to go too far down, but taking a little bit off, feathering a little bit back is going to help doing the actual setup to get everything dialed in. And it's important to note if you want to get a really tight setup with real low string heights, it can be really helpful. So when I'm doing that, I'm normally working with just like some square stock that I bought at Home Depot, and I'll buy it and take a file to whatever side of it is the most flat, because it's never actually flat. It's whatever's close enough to flat, or the closest to flat, and I'll file it as close to dead flat as I can possibly get it, checking it. You can buy them off of supply houses. Generally it's like a rectangular stock. It's generally really expensive. I'd rather just buy it and put the hour into like flattening it than pay somebody a huge amount of money for some stock that's been precision flattened. But I like to have it about the size of the fretboard itself, because of course, even though I'm not going to necessarily flatten that, if I need to take any down, it's easier if I can make the whole thing flat and then feather myself a little bit of a gap here back towards the joint, rather than like flatten this and then have to like guess this down to the right angle, and it's just easier to do it all at once. And then, yeah, I do it with the metal square stock. You could also do it with wood. You know, if you can get some like nice straight grained wood, it can work pretty well, and it'll mostly hold itself true from guitar to guitar, but I normally find that I have to true it up a little bit, which I think is annoying, but it's not really that big of a deal. So you do it with that. If you were real meticulous, you could do it just with a sanding block. You know, we're going to use the sanding block to feather, and you could do the whole thing if you really wanted to with one. You just probably be more careful. You want to be really careful while you're doing this anyway, to be checking the flatness as you go. You don't want to take any more than you have to away. It's also important, you know, you spent a bunch of time while you were cutting this neck joint setting up the actual string height, as it's going to shoot over the bridge and across the saddle. And so if you change, you know, you did that with the fretboard in mind, and you've got the fretboard locked in, and probably you've checked this to confirm that your measurements are all right and that everything works. And now while you're leveling it, you know, if you tilt it either direction like this, you're obviously going to shoot your strings higher, or you're going to drop your strings lower, and that could mess up all of the careful geometry you've set up. If you tilt either direction, you're going to tilt the saddle one way or another, and that could mess up your geometry. It's surprisingly pretty easy to cant something, to cant the fretboard while you're flattening, and it takes not that much care, just stopping every once in a while to check things to make sure that that doesn't happen, and some planning about what you're going to do. You know, like if it's real high in the middle and it drops off, maybe it's best to start with the smaller block and take the middle down and work out, rather than risk, you know, sort of leaning in one direction and flattening us down like this, and then suddenly you're shooting your strings down, or leaning the other direction and you're shooting your strings up. It can be helpful to plot out where you're high on the fingerboard and think about where you need to work. This fingerboard is actually really good. It's actually just a little high here and a little high here, and I don't know what it's going to do in the middle, because my straight edge rides on these edges. So I'm going to just flatten this whole thing. I normally do 150 or 220, just double stick taped to this, or spray adhesive to this. I'm going to get on that right now, so I'll be back in a minute. So the initial flattening of the fretboard is real simple. I'm going to work in two directions, across the fretboard like I'm doing here, and then down the length of the fretboard like I'm doing here. Like I said, I'm only going to move across the fretboard in one direction, to keep from wallowing out the middle. And I'm focused on maintaining everything as evenly as I can while I do this. When I'm moving it across the fretboard like this, it's hard to see in the video, but I'm kind of moving in a wiper pattern. The side on the fretboard extension is moving, you know, in a slight arc, so that I can keep everything in line with the string paths. It's also important to check everything often. It's a lot easier to catch a mistake early on than it is to go back and fix the mistake once you've gotten pretty far into it. But as I was saying, you know, when I'm moving this direction down the fretboard, I'm also not just moving straight down. I'm trying to follow the string paths. You know, the strings are going to spread out as they move down the fretboard, so I'm just trying to keep my leveling block moving in the direction that the strings are going to go, because that's how I like to do my setups, with a sort of compound radius as opposed to just a straight cylinder radius. So yeah, the other thing I would say that's really important, in the interest of keeping everything even at this stage, is to make sure that you reverse your direction. You don't want to go back and forth, but it can help to keep everything even, or it helps me to keep everything even, to be reversing direction. periodically. Okay, so once I've got the entirety of the fretboard level, including the extension, I'm going to start feathering the portion of the neck that is not going to be able to have relief pulled into it, either by the strings or by the truss rod. And I've made myself a tape mark that's sort of a do not go past point. It's easier for me to have a visualization to see that than just to keep a certain fret in mind that I don't want to go by. And I always like to make things easier on myself. This process is very similar to the flattening of the full fretboard. Very similar motion with the sanding block. I'm using a much smaller sanding block. It could be a little bigger than this, and it might make things a little easier. But I wouldn't want to deal with the big sanding block for such a small portion of the extension, and I don't think it would help with the feathering aspect. And so again, I'm trying to build some relief into the fretboard itself at this point. So I want my low point to be the end of the extension that's towards the bridge, and I want it to gradually and smoothly transition back to the flat portion of the neck where the strings are going to be able to pull relief, and the truss rod will be able to put relief in if it needs to. So this whole time I'm going to be keeping in mind that I need to make sure that I'm sanding that end of the extension the most, and sanding as I move towards the tape line less and less. So I like to do this really slowly because I think it helps with evenness. No matter what I've flattened the fretboard with as a whole, at this point I'm generally not going to use anything rougher than 220 grit sandpaper because it's definitely a very small amount that you want to take off, and it's better to be a little bit conservative and not take quite enough off, in my opinion, than it is to take too much off and then you put the frets on, you glue it on the guitar, and you're actually dropping off too much and your action gets too high, because then you're doing twice the work and you're going to be cutting back frets. If you decide to correct that problem, you're going to be cutting back frets, which is the whole point of avoiding that this is trying to address. Also very important, just like before, to check often so that you know when you're done, or if you're developing any problems. You certainly wouldn't want the fretboard to lean in any direction while you're bringing down the extension. That would also be a problem. You want to keep everything nice and even. Work slow, but it's pretty simple. It doesn't take that long. So I'm gonna finish this up, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I've got my fretboard nice and flat. It's sanded down into the shape that I want it. I've got a good radius worked into the extension on this fretboard and feathered into the rest of the neck. And so at this point I could just start fretting. I've of course cleaned out all my fret slots because in the process of flattening them, they're going to fill full of a bunch of dust from the sanding process. And I've checked the depth of these just to make sure that the tangs are going to be able to fit entirely in. And so with all that done, I could then start fretting this neck. But there's one step that I like to do to prep the fingerboard before I start fretting. It's really more about helping the person who's eventually going to refret this guitar than it is about helping me today. And that is going to be to chamfer each and every fret slot edge. So I want to take those sharp edges that we've made with the saw and just chamfer the corners so that there's not a sharp 90-degree angle. Because when you pull the fret back out, when the guitar needs to be refretted, the barbs in that corner are going to tend to work together to chip out the corner. And that's something that needs to be gone back and repaired during the fret job, because Those chips can be unsightly, and it leaves an uneven base for the next set of frets to sit on. It'll help me a little bit today because it'll help to get an easier seat on the frets themselves. But I think it's mostly about future repairability of the guitar. So there's two ways you can do it. You can do it with a knife. I've just got a sharp double bevel knife. It's real skinny, and I can just use it like a scraper and come along and from the outside in, just very carefully scrape a bevel. Scrape the chamfer in the fret slot with this, and I'm always going to work from the outside in, because if I work to the edge, I risk chipping out the edge of the fretboard, which wouldn't be any good. So that's one way you can do it. Be careful if you do it that way not to slip out and scratch your nice leveled fretboard that you've sanded up to your final grit at this point. You could also use a 3-corner file. This is a Riffler file. Standard straight file would also work. And for that, you're going to want to, you could just hold it straight and do both edges at the same time, but I'd rather it be instead of a 45-degree angle chamfer, I'd rather it be a little more slanted over. I don't want to dig in too far into the fret slot, or I'm going to start impeding the tang barb's ability to actually hold the fret down. So that would just be, lean it over, do one side, just a little bit, and then the same thing on the other side. Again, it doesn't need to be much, just a little bit on each fret slot. So I'll do that to this board before I start fretting, but otherwise we are basically ready to start knocking frets in. I've got my hide glue, which I'll talk about in a minute. I have got a feeler gauge to apply the hide glue into the fret slots. I've got a fretting hammer. It's a dead blow hammer, which is weighted material that's loose in the hammerhead. So when you swing down, a moment after you actually hit with the hammerhead, the weighted material hits, and it keeps the hammer from bouncing, which is helpful when you're fretting your guitar. I've got my frets, and I've got an organizer, which isn't absolutely necessary, but is super helpful. And then I've got a cloth that I'm going to dampen, and that'll help me clean up glue. A glue scraper, also helpful for cleaning up the hide glue. And I've got a heat gun on hand, which I'm going to use at the end of the process. But of course, I've cut my frets, but if you've been following along with the video, you haven't cut your frets yet. So let's talk a little bit about preparing for that. If you're like me and you've bought a bulk roll of fret wire, or 100 feet of fret wire, it comes in a big hoop. It's going to come with some radius already in it, in the size of that hoop. And if you're doing flat fingerboards, that's quite possibly enough. This is a pretty minimal radius on this neck, and so these frets, I can hold it up and I can see that the fret has actually got more radius than the fingerboard, which is what you want. Just it's going to be easiest if you have just a little bit more radius in the fret than you have on the fingerboard. If the fret's a little bit tighter radius than the fingerboard. But if you're buying for fret wire for a single guitar, there's a really good chance that you're getting flat segments of fret wire, in which case you're going to want to radius them, because when you're hammering a fret in, you can definitely hammer them flatter. You can loosen the radius on the fret wire, but what you're going to not be able to do is take a flat fret wire and hammer it in to make it match the radius on your fingerboard. It's just not gonna happen. And you're either going to end up with loose fret ends, or you're going to be relying on glue to hold them in, which basically means you're going to be having loose fret ends, and then you're going to be going back later and gluing them in, which is a real pain. And a fret radiuser is pretty easy to make. This is a really quick and dirty one, but it works. The idea is you have, at least 2 wheels, 3 wheels. The one is adjustable and is sort of a rest, or it could spin. This one, for ease of manufacture, I just clamp this where I want it, and these spin. You push the fret wire in one side, and it comes out the other with a radius. Adjust it out if you want a looser radius, adjust it in if you want a tighter radius. Cartridge bearings work really well for doing this. You can buy fret wire radiusers. They're kind of expensive for what they are, but you can definitely buy them from supply houses. But it's a pretty simple thing. You radius your frets, and then you need to cut them to size. And of course, every single fret is going to be a different size, and it's important to note radius and then cut. Don't cut and then try and radius, because radiusing individual frets is going to be it's just not going to work unless you cut them way over size. So radius and then cut. And when I cut my frets, I like to leave 3-4 millimeters on either side overhanging. I could cut them to be nearly exactly the right length, and I would save a little bit of fret wire, but then I find when I go back and I clean them up with the tang nippers, and I try and get right up on the fretboard and nip it off. If I have an overhang, I can get a nice clean cut along the fingerboard edge. If I don't have very much overhang hanging, then they tend to slip out, and I just end up cutting the edges off and getting the spear point on the end of the fret, and then that's even more annoying to file than like the full unnipped fret. So I would rather just leave them overhanging a little bit, because it makes the cleanup of the frets after I've glued them in a lot easier. So yeah, we are pretty much ready. I'm gonna chamfer all of these fret slots, and then we're gonna start hammering them in. So we're ready to start hammering frets in, and I've got my neck supported, which I'm going to want directly under the fret, this support while I hammer, and I can move this back as I work down the neck. It's noteworthy that if I was doing a traditional glue-on fretboard extension guitar, that I would be installing the frets with the body and the neck bolted together, so that the body itself could provide a little bit of support for this extension. And I would also, when I got down to the join and moved past it, I'd also be using this. This is just a bag of black beans inside a sock. You could also use like BBs, anything that's going to conform to shape. And I would be holding this inside the guitar, against the top, underneath the extension, to provide extra support while I hammer the frets in, because of course the top itself is not designed to be like hammered on. It'd probably be fine if I did, but it's good to have this as a little extra insurance and kind of soften the blow a little bit. This guitar with the cantilever neck, wouldn't work to do that, because this is just floating over the guitar anyway. And so I built this jig. It just rests, bolts onto the same bolts the body would bolt onto, and provides a little bit of support for this extension. And this extension is already a lot stiffer than a glue-on extension would be, because there's a bunch of wood underneath it, specifically there to support the extension. But this is a little extra insurance. So yeah, that's the big difference between this setup and what I would expect you might be doing for your guitar when you're fretting it, and what I would be doing for any other guitar I've ever fretted, acoustic guitar I've ever fretted. So let's go ahead and start fretting this. So before I put a fret in, I'm going to put a little bit of hide glue into the slot using a feeler gauge. I use it for other applications as well. I'm going to cover the whole slot with hide glue, and then I want to just place the fret into the slot. I'm going to pause here to say that your fret at this point should be over radiused, and so it should, at least for what we're doing today, and so it should sit just on the edges of the fingerboard in the actual slot. That's going to be helpful for holding it down, that radius, which we'll talk about in a second. Then I'm going to grab my hammer, and I just want to lightly tap one into the fret and then work across the fret. You want to resist the urge to hammer the fret a lot. It should seat really easily into the fret slot itself, and over-hammering can actually work against you in trying to get a well-seated fret that doesn't pop out at the ends. And that is because if you're over-hammering, you can bounce the fret out of the slot and you can deform the fret. And we talked about how the tang and the barbs on the fret will work to hold the fret itself in the slot, but it's also important to recognize that the shape of the fret, or the radius of the fret wire, is going to also be integral to holding the fret in. If you think about a well-seated fret with a radius that, say, exactly matches the radius in the fretboard, or a radius that is, if the fret has a memory still, mechanical material memory still of being over radiused, then when you seat that fret in the slot, it's not going to be inclined to have the ends of the fret want to pop out. But if you hammer it too much, you can essentially cold set the fret flatter than the radius of the fretboard. I talked earlier about how you can't hammer the radius into the fret, but you can definitely hammer it out of the fret. And when you do that, you're essentially making the fret want to pop, want to spring out of the ends of the fretboard. So it's really important to not hammer the frets too much. So again, we are going to put a little glue in, wipe some excess off, set my fret in. I'm not trying to work too fast here. Lightly tack one side in and work across. Again, not a lot of hammering. It's not difficult. It shouldn't be difficult to seat your fret. So you might ask why I'm using glue anyway. There's all these other ways that we've talked about that the fret gets held in place, and why hide glue specifically. I think the hide glue is a little extra insurance. It is going to help to freeze the fret in exactly the place that we have seated the fret. The glue itself is going to be able to flow into the spaces around the fret, under the fret, and any nooks and crannies, and then it's going to harden into like a glass hard sheath around the fret inside the slot, and that's going to help to tighten up the slot. It's going to help to securely hold the fret in for the long term, because it's probably going to be in there for years or decades before it gets refretted. And again, I'm not working super fast. Often on like cold days, I'm going to be hammering frets into already gelled up hide glue, because it just gels up in the slot so fast. But I'm not worried about that, because if you've seen the video I made about gluing binding and purfling with hide glue, you know that I sometimes like to think about hide glue as a sort of wood solder. And in this process, that is definitely the context that I'm thinking about the hide glue in. I don't need to move quickly, because when I get all the frets done, I'm going to go back, I'm going to use a heat gun, and we're going to heat the frets and the board itself up. Just enough, it doesn't need to be super hot, but enough to reactivate the glue. And that's going to allow the glue to flow into all those spaces and to fully encase the fret in the slot, and then to reharden in a shape that is completely surrounding the fret itself. And that reactivation property is something that's pretty unique to hide glue. amongst all the glues that I can think of. And as an added bonus for future repairability, because hopefully this guitar gets played enough to need a refret at some point, fresh hide glue will always stick to old hide glue, and so there's no need to fully clean it out, but it's going to redissolve, so it's potentially a boon to future repair, and it's certainly not in any way a hindrance to future repair, which I really like about hide glue. So here again, lightly tap in. You can lightly tap a little bit more after your first pass if you're unhappy with the seating, but you need to be really careful about how much you do. I'll also say that I like to go back and every few frets clean up the gel glue squeeze out around the frets. On the fret ends, you'll get little blobs. This is going to be the absolute easiest time to clean squeeze out away from the guitar to clean it off. Hide glue is going to dry pretty hard, and when we heat it, it seems like it's even harder to get off after you've done this heating cycle. For these fret ends, you don't need to get it, every tiny bit of glue off, but I like to not have the little glue balls stuck physically to the side of the fretboard, because they're just annoying to clean off, and it's much easier right now. So I'm going to continue fretting this, and we'll talk briefly about the actual final cleanup and heating of the guitar, of the frets, to achieve that really nice hold with the hide glue, and then we're going to have a fully fretted instrument. Once we've got all the frets in, I'm just going to go back across the board, and I'm going to do one more cleaning of the whole surface. It's easy to miss little bits of glue while you're fretting, and like I said, this is the easiest time to do it. The moisture is going to help our heating process a little bit, and I really hate having to go back after this to clean glue off the fretboard, because it's a lot more difficult. So I'm just going to go across the entire surface and clean that, and then we're going to start heating the frets. So once we're all cleaned up, it's just a matter of heating the fretboard and the frets up enough that we can reactivate the glue, get it back into a liquid state, and spreading out in the fret slots and around the frets. My heat gun is on basically the lowest setting, but the highest fan speed. But I don't need a lot of heat. I just need to heat it up enough to reactivate the glue. As a hand sort of gauge, it should be just getting to the point where it's uncomfortable to leave your hand on the surface, but not hotter. It shouldn't be painful to leave your hand on the surface. That's pretty much it. It just takes a few minutes to do this, and then I'll let it sit overnight. So that's it for our fret installation. I want to thank you for watching today. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, and if you're not already, please consider subscribing to my channel. Likes and subscribes help me to reach a wider audience, which helps me to make more videos. And so it's a win-win for everybody. I will be back soon with more guitar-related instructional videos, and hopefully a sound sample for this guitar when I finish finishing the guitar. And so I'll see you then. Thanks.